All right, so I think we should get started. Good evening and welcome to Serial Style, the Business of Being Irene Castle. I'm Diana Riesman, Executive Director of the Wharton Studio Museum. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Ithaca is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, in the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayakono's dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Wharton Studio Museum is preserving and celebrating Ithaca's and the region's motion picture history and developing the historic Wharton Studio building in Stewart Park into the Wharton Studio Park Center with exhibits highlighting Ithaca's role in early American movie making. That building is one of only a handful of motion picture studios from that era still standing in the country, and it's a very, very important artifact from a bygone era. Irene Castle, the focus of tonight's presentation, is one of the best known actors to have worked for the Wharton Studio and to have lived in Ithaca. As some of you might know, October is Silent Movie Month in Ithaca, proclaimed as such by Mayor Myrick in 2012, with some encouragement from Wharton Studio Museum. And so this is the 10th year that WSM and many other local organizations and entities are celebrating silent films and silent movie history with screenings, exhibits, and events such as this one. Tonight's virtual presentation by Cornell University Professor Denise Green is co-sponsored by Wharton Studio Museum, the Cornell Fashion and Textile Collection, Cornell's Public History Initiative, and the History Center, which is also graciously hosting this webinar. Miller Mayer, LLP, is presenting sponsor of Silent Movie Month this year, and we are grateful for its generous support. Denise Nicole Green is an associate professor of fashion design in the College of Human Ecology, where she also serves as the director of the Cornell Fashion and Textile Collection. She has curated a number of award-winning fashion exhibitions, including The Big Little Fashion City, Ithaca and Silent Film Style, which was a collaboration with the Wharton Studio Museum in 2016. She's recently co-authored the forthcoming book, Fashion and Cultural Studies, which will be published by Bloomsbury and available in print by December 2021. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Green, and we will happily take questions via the chat after the talk.
Thank you, Diana, for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to join all of you this evening to talk a little bit about Ithaca's silent film history and Irene Castle in particular. Diana, I think you'll need to mute yourself before we get started. There we go. Amazing. So I am broadcasting from home, so you'll also see my co-author here. That's my cat. There are a few of them, but it's really nice to be with all of you this evening. Again, we live in such an incredible place where we have a very rich history, not only of silent film, but also along with that, fashion. And so I teach fashion in the College of Human Ecology. We've had a fashion program in the College of Human Ecology since 1915 when we were the College of Home Economics, and are very excited about the future of design in our college, and as well the Cornell Fashion and Textile Collection, which with our program, when it was founded in 1915, also the collection was founded as a teaching and study collection. And Irene Castle actually donated a few items to our collection in the 1920s when she was living in Ithaca. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today, but I wanted to introduce you to Irene and her role both in fashion, the fashion industry, as well as the film industry, and of course, her love of animals. So I suppose it's appropriate that my love of animals also here with us tonight. Irene came to Ithaca in 1916 to film the biggest serial of all time as it was billed, Patria. And in the advertisements, you'll see that here this spread explains that she is America's best known and best dressed woman. What I love about this image is that you see here in this advertisement for Patria, all of the different outfits that she wore in the serial. And serials, for those who are unaware, a serial is an episodic like a Netflix series today or a television show. It's a series of episodes, and these were incredibly popular in this early nascent era of silent film. And the Whartons were known for the serial queen melodramas. These serials starred very powerful women. This is the era of the new woman, really working against Victorian sensibilities. This is also the era of women's suffrage. And Irene epitomized the kind of new woman that featured very strongly in the Wharton films. So in addition to Irene, there were a number of other very strong female leads in other serials, which we won't have time to talk about today, but I encourage you to look into those, some of those films, like The Romance of Elaine, The Mysteries of Myra, among others. So you can see, of course, Ithaca's very dramatic landscape was an important part of drawing the Wharton brothers to this place and to the possibility that it offered in silent film. We have, of course, here this image of Irene Castle and Milton Sills in the gorge, the dramatic waterfalls behind them. And of course, she's wearing jodhpurs, which was pretty revolutionary for this time. But how did we get here? Irene Castle had a penchant for fashion and theatricality from a very, very young age. Recently, Cornell University Library acquired the archives, the personal archives of Irene Castle that had been held by her granddaughter, Castle McLaughlin. And we're really so excited. These collections are being processed now, thanks to a very generous gift from John Foote and Kristen Rupert, alumni from the class of '74, made this possible for the library to archive and care for many hundreds of photographs of Irene dating back to her youth and through her time, both in Ithaca and beyond. So you can see here as a child, she actually quite enjoyed dressing up. And in her memoirs, she's written about the fact that she was incredibly interested in designing her own costumes for these theatrical productions when she was young. And her mother actually helped her sew and realize many of the garments that she wore. She did not sew or construct herself, to my knowledge, but she worked actually very closely with her mother. And she was very photographed, as you can see, even from a young age before her fame. She also always had a desire to be different. She innovated, and then there's the business component of it. So the exhibit that we've put together with the Wharton Studio Museum is part of Breaking Barriers, Women's Lives and Livelihoods in Tompkins County. And so Irene, we're looking at Irene not just as a fashion innovator, but also as a businesswoman. She was incredibly astute when it came to business, and she knew how to capitalize on her fame and on her celebrity. But she was also innovative before she became famous. So in 1908, another thing to say about the serial queen melodramas is that many of these women who were acting in these serials, they were doing many of their own stunts. They were very athletic. They were fearless. Pearl White was known as, fearless, peerless Pearl. And so Irene was a very avid swimmer. She was also a really excellent horsewoman. She did a lot of horseback riding. And she was swimming at a very young age. And in fact, in 1908, she was born, I should have said, on April 7th, 1893. She's a sort of classic Aries, a very fiery mentality. And she, in 1908, when she was quite young, in her teens, she actually cut off her hair. And she said it was for functional purposes because having long hair is not ideal when you're swimming in a swimming pool. And so she chopped it off into the bob. 1908, of course, is very early. The bob doesn't come into fashion really until the late teens. And I think a lot of people associate it with sort of the flapper aesthetic of the 1920s. In 1913, Irene Castle famously bobbed her hair again. And so what you're looking at here is an article on the left from the Ladies' Home Journal that was published in 1921. This is Irene at the time. She was Irene Castle Treeman. We'll talk a little bit about her marriage to Robert Treeman later. So she's actually recounting this history, a kind of mythology. She was also very good at mythologizing herself. And so this is her recounting in the Ladies' Home Journal of the first time and of course the second time she bobbed her hair in 1913. What's interesting as well is, of course, at this time, women are, excited about this new hairstyle, but it's a very big commitment, right, to cut one's hair. And so Irene actually worked with companies like the National Hair Goods Company Incorporated to actually produce wigs so that you wouldn't have to commit to cutting your hair, but in fact, you could tie it back, wear a wig, and appear as if you had what became branded as the Castle bob. Irene was incredibly good at branding herself, as was her husband, Vernon Castle, her first husband. And this also leads to an innovation that she calls the Castle band. So you have the Castle bob with this short hairstyle. And then she also innovated with this little band that would be worn around the head to keep the hair in place. I think, if you've ever had short hair, if it's a little too short to tuck behind the ears, and if it's wavy, it can get out of hand. And so she said she invented the Castle band as a way to manage her hair. And so in a lot of these images of her from this period, you'll see her wearing this band around her head. And this is to really keep the hair in place. The Castle band was another way for her to really market not only the product itself, but her name, again, building on that kind of celebrity. And I also want to point out that this dress that you see on the far right is actually extant. It exists today as part of the Metropolitan Museum's Costume Institute, where she donated a number of garments that we'll see. So how did she become famous? She met Vernon Castle when she was vacationing in New Rochelle, when she was just in her late teens, and they married quite young. And she was not a formally trained dancer, but she loved dancing and she loved theatricality and she loved physicality. She was very athletic. And so dancing was a way for her to bring all of these interests together, the aesthetics, the athletics, and the joy. Excuse me. And so in her memoir, she writes in 1958 that part of the reason she and Vernon became such a sensation, they were a sensational couple known for their dancing. It wasn't easy at first. It wasn't like immediately they became famous, but they actually left for Europe and they spent some time in Paris. And that's where they garnered and became quite famous. And she writes in her memoir, she says, we were clean cut, we were married, and when we danced, there was nothing suggestive about it. We made dancing look like the fun it was. And so gradually we became a middle ground both sides could accept. And again, thinking about this time period, we're talking about 1911, 1912, 1913. And so we're starting to see the shift, women participating in athletics, participating in physical education, and participating in what Vernon and Irene Castle termed modern dancing. And they created a number of dancing clubs. And in these dancing clubs, this was an opportunity for the elite, for socialites to come to dance, again, in a sort of clean-cut environment that was sort of sanctioned socially. But to get into these clubs, you had to pay. And this is an article from Vogue in 1913. If you dance, you must pay the piper. And so these dancing clubs, I think they weren't, it wasn't until really like Studio 54, much later in the century, that you have the kinds of lines to get in, right, to participate in this dancing scene. They wrote a book together around that same time called Modern Dancing. And this book is really, really a fascinating text. You can actually, it's out of copyright. And so you can find it online on archives.org and also through the Library of Congress. So if you want to take a look yourself later tonight, you can Google it and find it. It's completely digitized. And there are a number of very interesting chapters in this book, including one on dress reform. So Irene is writing in this book about, the need to get rid of the corset, to free women's bodies so that they can actually move and that they can dance. And one of my favorite quotes in this book, she says, "You too could be slim and healthy and in love if you danced." And so it's this idea, right, that dancing will bring you so much joy and, of course, keep you physically fit, happy, and healthy. So in the book, you'll see on the left here, this is an image that's found actually in the book Modern Dancing, and they depict through photographic images the different dance moves. They were famous for what became known as the Castle Walk. And again, with their fame, Castle became a brand. There was the Castle Walk. We saw the Castle Band. There's the Castle Bob. And so Castle begins to be applied to a number of different things, from dances to fashion products, and et cetera. In 1915, the Court Film Corporation approaches the Castles. Again, they're the darlings of New York City socialite scene. They have Castles in the Air, among other dancing clubs, and they approach them to do a silent film, semi-autobiographic, of course, fictionalized in other ways, but this was an opportunity for Irene and Vernon to play themselves on the silver screen. And this was really the first feature film that Irene Castle and Vernon Castle participated in, not a Wharton film. And the film enabled them to reach a much wider audience, right? If you have a dancing club, you're really limited to what the occupancy has been approved for that space. And so with silver screen, suddenly the Castles were all across the country. And then many of these films, of course, traveled to Europe as well. And so this was a way to bring the Castles around the world. And from those films, the Castles began to endorse a number of different fashion products. And so one of them here, the Vernon Castle pump. Of course, really, it should be the Irene Castle pump. But of course, at the time, she was known as Mrs. Vernon Castle. But in this particular shoe, it actually incorporates a new kind of fashion technology, this elastic instep band, she says, which she's saying in this letter to the Regal Shoe Company, the elastic instep band, which you have cleverly concealed with a broad ankle strap. It's a Parisian idea, which I, quote, brought over without duty with a few new steps. And so the Castles had gone to Europe and spent a lot of time in Paris in 1911, 1912, where they really made a name for themselves in that scene. And with that celebrity came back to the United States and brought with them, again, many of the things that they learned there, including some of these innovations related to fashion. And so we have the Regal Shoe Company is selling the Castle pump. And you can see another advertisement for it on the left as well. But it's not just shoe innovations that Irene brought back from Europe when she returned. She also brought another kind of fashion accessory, which is the Brussels Griffon, really adorable, sort of Chewbacca-like tiny dog that she would carry around with her in multiples. And so many of the fashion photographs that we have of her, she's carrying these absolutely adorable little gremlins known as the Brussels Griffon. And today you can find many celebrity Brussels Griffons on Instagram as well. I particularly love to follow Bad Girl Teeny, but these Brussels are really delightful dogs. And Irene is actually credited with bringing the breed to the United States. And so it wasn't Paris Hilton who invented the tiny dog as a fashion accessory. This is a long-standing tradition amongst celebrities, and arguably Irene was one of the innovators of the tiny dog as fashion accessory. She also did work with, ironically, corset companies. So while on the one hand, she was arguing in her book that, ridding oneself of a corset would enable dancing in different ways, she was also simultaneously endorsing particular kinds of corsets like the red fern corset, which was designed to be apparently much more comfortable than more traditional highly boned corsets because of the invention of and use of elastic. This enabled a lot more flexibility for corsetry. And so, maintaining a particular figure while at the same time enabling movement and comfort. And I want to point out that in this Vogue advertisement for the red fern corset, she's actually wearing a dress by Lady Duff Gordon, Lucille. Lucille was her really go-to designer. Lucille was known around the world for her incredible design. She worked with a lot of theater actors in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and Irene was one of her big clients. And Lucille really recognized the power of celebrity and the power of silent film actresses, but theater actresses before that, to bring these incredible designs to the stage and then later to the silver screen. The dress that Irene is actually wearing here in this advertisement is also extant. It is part of the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and is an absolutely beautiful thing that I hope to see in person one day. You'll see that dress again here in this Vogue advertisement from 1914. This dress was actually made for Watch Your Step, which was a theatrical production that Vernon and Irene participated in. So it wasn't just the dancing clubs, they were also on the stage. And of course, the stage was another place to really share fashion. But what silent film, of course, offers that the stage cannot is the ability to have many multiple costume changes throughout the production, right? So when you're working in theater, costume changes take a little time, right? And so, you can't ask the audience to wait. Whereas with film, you just do a cut, you do the change, you start rolling again. And so you can actually share quite a number of garments. She also worked with, I should say, a number of silk companies. So silk was, this is before the advent of synthetic fabrics. And so silk really is a fiber that can hang and drape in just beautiful, beautiful ways. And so she worked with the H.R. Mallinson company here. You can see this Pussy Willow advertisement from 1915. And oftentimes, these were textile companies. And so she would work with different designers to model their designs made of silks from these different companies. She was also just generally found in the pages of Vogue, Harper's, Town and Country, these different society and fashion publications of the time. And she became really a leader and an arbiter of style during this period in the 19-teens. So, here we have from September 1916, there's the Brussels Griffon. I would like to point out she is holding this adorable little dog as her fashion accessory. And she, the title says new hats that possess the added distinction of being worn by Mrs. Vernon Castle. And so really she was the value added to many of these fashion designs. Mrs. Castle on this next advertisement from the next month in October. Mrs. Castle finds that those who dance must pay the furrier. And, you know, this sort of the irony, of course, later in life and throughout her life, she really loved animals very deeply and did a lot of animal advocacy in her later years. But the fashion trend in this time, you know, feathers on hats and furs. This is again before the advent of synthetic furs and faux furs. So she's also wearing, of course, the skins of many of the animals that she so loved. But Irene was also a fashion designer. I mentioned that she worked with her mother to design many of her costumes when she was a young girl, and she continued this practice into her later years as well. This is a garment that appeared in Vogue magazine in 1915. It's a garment that she designed herself. You can see this was the illustration in the center that appeared in Vogue. One part audacity, two parts pantalettes, and the most important part, the fact that Mrs. Vernon Castle designed it and her mother made it. So her mother was really an important part of her ability to render her fashion ideas into something real. What I love about this skirt is there must have been some kind of wire that was put through the hem to really give it that fullness. And then the audacity being the fact that she's wearing these pantaloons underneath. Again, this is a time in fashion when women did not wear bifurcated garments like trousers or pantaloons, and if they did, they were wearing them for, you know, physical education classes. As much as we've all heard about Amelia Bloomer in the mid 19th century, really, you know, bloomers didn't take off. They were really sort of ridiculed, and there are certainly lots of cartoons poking fun at bloomers and bloomerism and dress reform. But here we see Irene starting to adopt this dress. And of course, also around this period is when Paul Poiret and other fashion designers are also starting to bring in Turkish trousers and other kinds of pantaloons. So this was considered quite radical. And I love this fashion image here on the far right, which was done by Ira Hill. Ira Hill was one of her go-to photographers, a photo studio she worked with quite closely in New York City. And she's actually holding up the dress, my goodness, to show the pantaloons underneath. And I love that even the sleeves on this dress, these big belled sleeves on the bodice, are mimicking the pantaloons, right? That double layer of, again, this is fur. So she's using fur in rendering this design with the little ducks appliqued along the edges. In 1916, Vernon, you know, he decides he's British. He really feels very strongly that he wants to join the war effort, and he receives his flying certificate in 1916. He enlists. He is part of the 84th Royal Flying Corps Squadron. You'll see he's actually here with his monkey. Irene and Vernon, in addition to the Brussels Griffons, they had really an entire menagerie of animals. And this was also something that was a bit of a fashion fad amongst the elite of this period, was to have a whole range of animals, from birds to mammal, you know, monkeys and others. And so this was actually a monkey that one of their pet monkeys. And so there are a number of photographs of him here with the monkey. And remember this jacket later, because we'll actually see Irene wearing some version of this jacket in Patria. So he joins, he enlists. And at that point, Irene says, well, that's my dancing partner. And they were performing with Watch Your Step at this time. He actually leaves to do his training, his flight training. And unfortunately, later in 1918, dies in a flight training accident. His monkey was actually in the plane with him, and the monkey survived, but he did not. So in 1916, Irene says, I am not going to dance again. I cannot dance again because her partner, her husband, her love has enlisted. And so this is really the moment when William Randolph Hearst, who is of the Hearst Empire, the media mogul, He is who invests in Patria, which was going to be the biggest cereal of all time, or as you see here in the advertisement, the cereal supreme. And so it was funded by the International Film Corporation, which was a Hearst endeavor. The Whartons directed the first 10 episodes, and they were made in Ithaca mostly. And so we have here the opportunity. William Randolph Hearst sees the opportunity and seized to draw Irene in. And she had actually won, the audience favorite Best Motion Picture Actress Award for 1916 after The Whirl of Life, her first major feature film. And so Hearst says, you're this, famous film celebrity. You're not dancing anymore. So how about, you get on the silver screen? Because she had a lot of energy. She may have stopped dancing, but she certainly did not stop moving. And so he really used this opportunity to draw her in and to employ her to come to Ithaca and to play Patria Channing, the lead in Patria, the serial. So she's wearing on screen on the left, this is another dress by Lucille. And what's really interesting at this time, when we watch films today, of course, there's a credit for the costume designer for the film. And in this nascent period of film, you have maybe a wardrobe mistress, but not really a accredited costume designer for film. And so the major fashion designers really saw this as an opportunity to get their designs on the screen. It's one thing to get them on the stage, but again, there's a discrete number of people that attend a theatrical production. But with film, it was a much wider audience. And so you have these episodic serials. They often ended with the cliffhanger. So a couple of weeks later, you go back for the next installment. There was no binge watching at this time. You really had to wait for it, go back. And of course, film, as I mentioned before, offered the opportunity for multiple costume changes. And so designers like Lucille were really excellent product placers. They ensured that the celebrities that they worked with were wearing their designs on the silver screen. And so we see that here with Irene in Patria. This is another image. I love this image. This was given to me by Sue Cosentini. Her grandfather, Joe Cosentini, you can see here at the back, this was from his personal collection. So this actually doesn't come from a formal archive in, at Cornell or elsewhere or the History Center, but this is a personal archive. And so you can see the names of all the famous actors, Dick Stewart, Warner Oland, for example. And then of course, noting where he is in the scene. And this is a scene in the episode 4 of Patria called Double Crossed, in which Irene actually plays not only Patria Channing, but also Elaine, the dancer, who is like a double. She looks almost exactly like Irene, except she has long hair. So we'll see a scene in a minute where the hair is actually chopped off so she can appear like Patria. But I show this image because really all of these folks, these are local Ithacans who are participating as extras in the film. And that was part of the draw, right? The Whartons came to Ithaca, not only for the dramatic landscape, but for the fact that there were a lot of students here. There are a lot of really interesting buildings, on campus, but they would have this large group of potential extras that could be employed in these films. So I mentioned to remember Vernon's jacket. So this is, Patria was a World War I preparedness serial. It ended up being censored by Woodrow Wilson because unfortunately, as much as folks wanted it to be World War I preparedness, in a productive way. In fact, the film negatively depicted the Japanese who were allies and are allies in World War I. And in fact, in the storyline, they're collaborating, conspiring with Mexico to invade the United States. And so Woodrow Wilson actually required dramatic cuts of the serial, which sort of rendered the storyline pretty illegible. But all of this to say, the World War I aesthetic was a really important part of her dress. And again, because we don't have really costume designers per se at this time, she's drawing from her own wardrobe. And so she was very adamant to tell folks that she was wearing Vernon Castle's uniform as her costume in the film. She wore a number of other items which you saw in the original advertisement. I'm just going through a few of them here, and really she's wearing like pretty much anything that a woman could possibly wear at this time. And with Elaine, you'll see she does this. This is Elaine actually cutting her hair. This is one of the surviving clips. There's a little bit of a jump cut there, but you can see her cutting her hair into the bob, which of course is just sort of reinforcing this mythology of Irene Castle and her role in shaping this major fashion trend. This is a scene that was actually shot at the New Amsterdam Hotel in New York. So it's one of the few scenes that wasn't shot directly in Ithaca, but she's actually dancing here. These are the Ziegfeld Follies. And what's wonderful about the archive that was recently acquired by Cornell University is that we have these photo albums, hundreds and hundreds of photos. So we have about like 10, 15 or so different photos of just this dress. And you can see in the film, it's, the quality of the film doesn't give you the kind of detail that you can get with these incredible studio photographs. So we're able to see not only the castle band. In the film, she's actually wearing more of a dragonfly style castle band. In the photograph, she's wearing a more simple castle band, but we get a sense of the dress, a little bit of movement, but really the details. We can zoom in on these images and see so much detail about the garment and its construction. I also want to point out that she's wearing here an anklet, and Irene also claimed to have invented the anklet. Of course, there are many other cultures around the world where people wear anklets, ankle bracelets, but this was another one of her fashion innovations. This is another shot of her from that the same scene in Patria, where she's wearing both the anklet and that headdress. Oh, my computer's getting a little... There we go. And these are some production stills as well from September 1916, when she's wearing Vernon's training jacket. The Whartons also experimented with split screen. And so you'll see here, this is a split screen. Oops, go back one. See if I can play this video. So split screen, of course, enabled us to see multiple Irenes at once. And this was actually really important in the episode about Elaine, the dancer, episode 4, because they needed to do split screen in order to ensure, right, that Irene could appear in the same frame, but as two different people. And here again, a few more images. And this is Vernon and Irene's dog. In addition to the Brussels Griffon, that wasn't the only breed of dog that they had. They had many, many animals. And just another image to get a sense of both the animal, or the dog, and Irene in this uniform. And as I mentioned, we saw this dress before. This is another one of the Lucille designs that appeared in Patria. Lucille appeared frequently. Her designs appeared in Patria, but Irene also wore a number of other designers as well, and actually worked with a number of designers to create new fashion items that then could be sold. And so Patria really became a promotional film, especially after the cuts were ordered by Woodrow Wilson. The film itself, again, became sort of illegible in terms of its storyline. And so instead, I argue that it became more of a fashion film. It just became an opportunity for Irene to wear all of these different styles and then also to market them after and during the circulation of the film. So a designer that she worked with quite frequently during this period is Fabergé, and this was a New York on Fifth Avenue fashion house. And so this is something called the Patria Georgette, which was a motoring headdress. Of course, cars at the time, much more exposed. So women and men wore dusters and other kinds of garments outside of the body to protect their outerwear. And so this is a headdress that she wore in Patria, and it's actually featured in a number of promotional materials. It was later sold by Fabergé as well. And so you can see the advertisement here, which appeared in Vogue in April 1917. So this advertisement in April 1917, Patria is released in January. There's a pre-release in November, December 1916, and then the cuts were ordered, and then it was recut, re-edited, and released in 1917. So this advertisement is really running at pretty much the same time that the serial is showing across the country. The Patria pompon is another. This is an accessory. This is a garment, a hat, I should say, not a garment. So this is a hat, the Patria pompon, which was produced by the Gimbel brothers, who were milliners. And then this is another Fabergé piece that appears in Patria. I just love this image of Irene, and you can see this silk velvet is absolutely gorgeous. And so she appears working with Fabergé, but as well, she's in the Delineator and a number of other publications at the time. Here we have her wearing Castle hats. Again, really that branding comes through. Oops, going back here. I can see some stuff is going on in the chat, but I can't multitask, so I'm going to come to it at the end. So one of the main relationships that Irene develops during this Patria period is with the Corticelli silk mill in Northampton, Massachusetts. And the Corticelli silk mill actually began in the early mid-19th century as an abolitionist commune. Sojourner Truth lived there for a little while and participated in the effort to produce silk. It's part of a larger kind of silk mania that took over the Northeast in the mid-19th century. And this idea that, we're spending so much money importing silk into the United States when actually we could produce it ourselves. And silk rearing isn't actually that challenging. Of course, it is very labor intensive and challenging, but the idea was it could be a cottage industry that women and children in the household could help participate in. And so there are a number of silk mills that emerge at this time, and the Corticelli silk mill by different name in the mid-19th century, and then eventually becomes the Corticelli silk mill. They, by the 19-teens, are of course importing silk, not importing raw silk and then making it into textiles. And so Irene works with the Corticelli silk mill to produce satin Patria. So a new textile that is named for Patria Channing, the star, the lead in this, serial supreme. So these are a number of advertisements that ran in Vogue in 1917, again, right around the same time that the serial was circulating in movie theaters across the United States. I love cats, as you probably noticed. And so these, I love the Corticelli silk mill because this is the Corticelli cat. And the Corticelli cat was always getting itself tangled up in the thread and looking very cute as it's knocking around these different spools. I'll talk a little bit later about Irene Castle's fashion brand that she developed with them specifically, but this is the silk company. So we have Satin Patria launches in August 1917. And this really starts a connection and a collaboration that Irene would foster for the next 10 years. So for an entire decade, from 1917 to 1927, she worked with the Corticelli silk mill, first with this endorsement contract and later with her own fashion line. A few more advertisements just to give you a sense. And of course, advertisements at this time, a lot more text than we're used to today. And there's, of course, much to be learned in reading about the way that these textiles were described. This is from a photo shoot. Again, these are Ira Hill photographs. This is the actual Corticelli cat, or a cat that was meant to be the Corticelli cat. What's great about the photo albums is that we can see the entire series of photos, and then we can actually see which one was chosen for the advertisement. So obviously they're taking lots of photos, but which one makes the cut? This is one of the great reasons to actually go to the archive, right, and see the materiality, the photos themselves, because we can get a little bit more context. This is an accessory that she's holding here. It's called the Castle Canteen. Again, branding everything. The Castle Canteen was another item that appeared in Patria that was then sold. More satin Patria. So really, I mean, we're talking, you know, it was running in Vogue, like every issue of Vogue had an advertisement for satin Patria for about a year straight. And of course, this is, right, World War I era. And so silk was actually being advertised as patriotic because it's conserving wool. And so this is another important part of silk, right, is that it's a possible to still purchase and not have to feel bad that you're taking away wool that would be used for military uniforms. Irene continues her filmmaking after Patria, which you can see here. We're sort of moving from 1915 up to her last film, Slim Shoulders, in 1922. So in many films. 1917, right, was a big year for her. She's done, you know, 5 films in that year, same in 1918. I love this double exposure on the right. This is from a photo album that came again with her personal archive. There's an amazing photo album that is literally her own personal snapshots and shots that her friends took and her colleagues when she was working on set. So when you go to the History Center to see the exhibition, you'll actually be able to visit the kiosk. And we worked with Cornell University Library. We're so grateful to their digital consulting and production services group. They were able to digitize this entire, you know, personal photo album of Irene's like snapshots of being on set on all of these different sets. So not just Wharton films, but many of these different films that she worked on throughout the late 19-teens. And so I highly encourage you, go to the History Center. You'll be able to literally, you know, thumb through and see all of the images in this album. We literally digitize the album itself. So it's not just picture by picture, but actually page by page. So you can see how Irene organized the photographs in the album, which I think is a really important part of how she curated her representation of her life and the memories she wanted to keep of this time. In 1918, Vernon dies in a flight training accident, as I mentioned. And, you know, Irene had been in Ithaca at a certain point. I think in 1916, she had met Robert Treeman, and then they reconnected, and they were married in May of 1919. And so they, Robert Treeman is absolutely just falls head over heels, I think, both for one another. I love this image of them together picnicking with their little picnic basket. And so they are married in 1919. And as a wedding present, the Treeman family gives to Irene Greystone, which is now the home to the Sigma Chi fraternity, and you can still drive by and see today on Huga Heights Road. It's also the first home in Ithaca to have a private swimming pool. You can see Irene here swimming in the pool. And we also have, as part of the archive, one of her personal photo album of her life, you know, in Ithaca and with Robert Treeman. And she designed the landscaping, all of this work that's coming down to the pool and the pool itself. And she would have salt water trucked in. There's no filtration system on this pool. It's like a giant bathtub with a plug at the bottom. And so salt water, she believed to be, you know, better for health, but also a little bit longer lasting when you don't have a filtration on a pool. So she would have it trucked in. And again, she loved swimming, and she absolutely loved doing athletic activities. And this was something that she shared with Robert Treeman. They both loved horseback riding, they loved swimming, they loved being in the outdoors, they loved animals, and they shared that together. And you can see here the exterior of Greystone. You know, of course, the press is, you know, very gossipy. And so this is an article, you know, should Mrs. Castle have waited a little longer? Of course, there were rumors that she had actually eloped with Robert Treeman the year prior, so only a couple of months after Vernon's death in February 1918. Those can neither be confirmed or denied, but she officially married him in May 1919, but this is a sort of funny image. Of course, they've put Robert Treeman on a leash here along with her Brussels Griffon. So while Irene comes to Ithaca, she's living in Greystone, 1919 to 1923. And during this time, she is painted twice by Cornell's first fine arts professor, Olaf Bronner. Olaf Bronner came to Cornell in 1890. He was still, you know, in his 20s. He founded the fine arts department at Cornell in 1921. So this is their 100th anniversary, their centennial. And he painted Irene again twice. These two paintings were put on display internationally at a number of different retrospectives in the 1920s. And the one on the left has come as part of the archive that was recently acquired by Cornell. So while the archival materials will go to the Cornell University Library, this painting will actually go to the Johnson Museum of Art. And right now it's on display as part of our exhibit. So again, really, if you're in Ithaca, I strongly encourage you to go and see this painting in person, because there's nothing that can compare to seeing an artwork really in real life. Now, the second painting, the one on the right, we don't know where it is. And so I'm always putting it out there. If anyone knows what private collection this painting has ended up in, please let us know. We're desperate to see it in color. So the only photographs that exist of the second painting that Olaf Bronner did are in black and white. And so certainly we'd love to see a color rendering, because of course, most of the images or all of the images of Irene of this time are, you know, all the photographic images are in black and white. And so paintings give us a sense and a texture and color that we can't otherwise really see. What's interesting about this painting is that it ends up on the cover of Town and Country magazine in January of 1923. And the dress that she's wearing appears in Harper's Bazaar as well, in an illustration done in the February 1922 issue. So we know, you know, this is February 1922, January 1923. So for about a year, right, this is, we can sort of estimate around the time that Bronner did the painting and where this dress came from. So in the Harper's Bazaar article, and I want to thank my colleague, Randy Brian Bigham, who alerted me to this article in Harper's, where it says that she is actually the designer of this dress. So in the Harper's article, it says that Irene, in fact, designed this dress, and she designed it with for the diamond buttons that were given to her when she was in Paris, that same period when she was in Paris, ascending to fame and collecting Brussels Griffons and dancing with Vernon. She also met the Grand Duke, who's also an Olympian, Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia. he gave her apparently 8 diamond buttons. And what's interesting is that this dress is also extant. It exists at the Costume Institute as well. She donated a collection of her garments to the Costume Institute in the 1940s. But she replaced the diamond buttons with imitation pearls. And the other interesting thing about the Met's records is that unlike what it said, the Harper's Bazaar article, which is the primary source of that moment, 1922, says that Irene designed the dress. The materials at the Met records say that the dress was designed by Lucille. So again, it raises a lot of questions. This is, we have 2 contradictory sources. Who designed this dress? And really, I think it speaks to the way that Irene actually worked very close with her couturier, her Lucille. Lucille and Irene likely worked sort of together and perhaps negotiated in different ways this design. But the other thing about Pavlovich is that he, of course, took part in the assassination of Rasputin. He was then banished to the war front in Persia, and then later escaped the Russian Revolution to Europe, where he supposedly later had an affair with Coco Chanel in the 1920s. So a lot of entangled fashion histories here. So Irene continues her work with the Corticelli silk mill. You'll see she's also not only working with Corticelli, but there's a sort of trifecta here between Corticelli, Irene, and Lucille. And many of the advertisements for Corticelli are featuring, garments that are from Lucille's workshop. And so this connection between Irene, Lucille, Corticelli, and, coming back to that dress we saw in the previous slide, it sort of helps us to understand the layering and complexity of the authorship of design during this period, when clearly we have a number of different folks coming together to imagine the fashions of the period. And so this is a style booklet that was produced, and this style booklet is actually on display as part of the exhibit right now. So you can actually see the original. There are a few of these that exist in the world. When we showed our exhibit in 2016, Ryan Bigham actually loaned us his copy of this. And so now we have our own copy in the Cornell University library that came with Irene's archive. So Irene's final 3 films were produced by Whole Tray Productions in 1922. Whole Tray Productions was a collaboration between Edwin Hollywood and Robert Treman. And these 3 films all starred Irene. I think, the Wharton studio went bankrupt in 1919. And so that wasn't a possibility for film production during this period. And so this was a new production company, and it was how exactly it was funded. This is one of the big questions. But unfortunately, all 3 of these films flopped. And shortly thereafter, Irene received one of her bills from her designer, Lucille. And a Lucille bill, of this period would probably run about $3,000, $4,000, maybe $5,000. And in her memoir, she writes that she received a Lucille bill, and she went to check her bank account, where she apparently had $64,000 of her own money that had been in that bank account, and that $64,000 went missing. So the $64,000 question was, where did that money go? And in fact, Robert Treman, apparently, according to her memoir, again, Castles in the Air, which she published in the 1950s, she said that he spent that money funding the films that flopped. So Irene and Robert Treman traveled to Paris to get divorced. It was not easy to get divorced in New York State in 1923. So they traveled to Paris, where they were able to expedite their divorce. And because Irene was left without this cushion, this financial cushion of her $64,000 in the bank, she decides that she's going to really lean into this collaboration with the Corticelli silk mill. And actually, she's a famous actress. She's, we saw that long list of film productions. She's considered the best dressed woman in America. And so she's like, well, we're just going to do not just fabrics, but I am going to be, we're going to create a fashion line. And so Irene Castle Corticelli Fashions launches in 1923. And I'll just go through, I'll show you a few extant examples. These are 3 examples that we showed in the original exhibition in 2016. The one in the center was loaned to us from the Ohio State Clothing and Textiles Museum. And then you'll see the one that was on the far right. This is just a little sneak peek of the exhibition that's on display right now. So I hope you all will go there, because you can actually pull out all of these drawers. And that's that little pamphlet that I told you about earlier. And we also acquired a new Irene Castle Corticelli Fashions garment, again, thanks to John Foote and Kristen Rupert, who were able to acquire this original for us. We can tell it's an Irene Castle Corticelli fashion because she had her own labels. There's the adorable Corticelli cat. And so this is a silk ribbon velvet with these like chiffon pieces that cascade down the front of the garment. But as we were doing research about this, because the Irene Castle Corticelli Fashions, this is actually a Rothschild's ad from the Ithaca Journal, we were able to actually find the dress. But what you'll notice is the dress was missing these little sleeves underneath. It's missing the collar, it's missing the belt. And so we were like, oh, this is such a great dress. It looks great on its own. But in fact, we discovered upon further research that we're missing the underdress and the belt. And it sold for $50 to $65. And that's really, somewhere around like $750 in like today, if we adjust for inflation. But we had all this information, right? Like it's Corticelli crepe romaine, it's got ribbon velvet. And so I worked with a really fabulous student in my department all of spring semester, Simone White. She's a fashion design student, incredibly talented. And she decided, we're going to exhibit this dress as part of Breaking Barriers and as part of the serial style exhibit. She's like, we're going to make a historical reproduction. And so using this basic information that we had, really, we only had this illustration of the dress. She used that information to source fabric. She used the Corticelli crepe here to source a very similar silk fabric. And then she actually dyed the fabric with walnut hulls. So she used a natural dye and she worked with different mordants, adjusted the iron content, and various things in order to arrive at the perfect matching color. And then she used that fabric to create the underdress. And so I'm so proud of her. You can come and see it for yourself at the Tompkins Center for History and Culture, right on the Ithaca Commons. And it's shown alongside a couple of other extant examples of Irene Castle Corticelli fashions. And so she continues with this collaboration through the mid-1920s. Sometimes the advertisements say that she designed the dresses. Other times they say that they're the same silk frocks that she's wearing. So, designed by someone else, but she selected them. And so, throughout the 20s, and you can see as we move into like a more Art Deco aesthetic here in 1927, and 1927 is the final year. This is the last moment that we see advertisements for Irene Castle Corticelli fashions. And often the advertisements would list the locations of where you could purchase them. So if you look closely, you can actually find Ithaca, New York, right there at Rothschild's. You could buy your Irene Castle Corticelli fashions. So I want to thank everyone. I know we've come to the end of our time. I'd love to take questions. If anyone has any questions, I want to thank all of the folks who have helped with this research over the years. So many different entities, and it's been really a lot of fun to collaborate with everyone to dive into this really unique fashion and film history of our town. So I will take any questions, Diana, if anything, and Ben, if anything's come through in the chat.
Yeah, I'm not seeing,
and I'll look forward to
questions in the chat.
Answering any inquiries you might have.
I've been making the little chat activity you saw was, I made little notes as you were speaking, just to elaborate on certain points that you were making. But I have a question for you, Denise. You mentioned that, for example, it seemed that Irene kind of picked her own wardrobe to play the various roles that she was playing. And one of the areas that we don't know much about, we know a lot about the cinematographers and the production designers, is the wardrobe department, or the, I don't know if they called it the wardrobe department or the costume department, but I've never really seen stills of any room or space in the Wharton studio that was dedicated to, you know, piles of fabric and sewing machines and all that. So do you think pretty much when someone was hired in a certain role, when they got a certain role or they were extras, it was sort of wear your own clothes kind of thing? Did they have, I know there was Mame Hennessy.
Yeah, and
you want to talk about her for a second as a
sure,
wardrobe?
yeah. So Mame Hennessy, Mary Hennessy, she was the wardrobe mistress, I suppose you'd call her, for the Wharton studio. And what's interesting is that we were actually just at the archives last night at Cornell with some of our students, and we were looking through the archives that Mame Hennessy had donated. And you know, there are a lot of photographs and things, but again, there aren't actually photographs of the actual backstage, you know, production. And perhaps that's because, you know, people didn't want to ruin the illusion, right? Like film is, you know, we're not supposed to see the back end. We're not supposed to see behind the curtain. And so perhaps that's not, you know, that's why these photographs or that kind of documentation doesn't exist, because it would have disrupted this illusion that's created on screen of the seamless. I mean, that's, you know, classical continuity editing. You're not supposed to notice, right? But undoubtedly, there were a lot of people working behind the scenes to make sure that the wardrobe looked correct. I mean, even in the image I showed where, you know, we had some of the local Ithacans in that scene from episode 4 in Patria, you know, they're all dressed in suits, right? And so, I mean, certainly people probably had suits in their wardrobe and maybe they were told, you know, come with your tails, you know, and your suits on, and there were certainly, like in the Mysteries of Myra, for example, there were definitely costumes that were made that were often like very creatively, I think, produced. But we don't, you know, I have not seen any actual garments from those productions. And so it's really kind of frustrating because you know that they existed at some point in time, but they're, you know, they're gone now. And that aspect of production wasn't documented in the same way that the sort of front end of the film production documented in like production stills and things like that.
Yeah, that was interesting what you said. Sort of, it is very true about the, you know, the artifice of film and the sort of fantasy that you don't really want to cross that line. You want the fantasy. You don't want to know what went into creating the scenery or the you know, the costumes. And that was that fascination with film, which was a very, very early, it's still very early in terms of film as an art form and as an industry, though Hollywood, excuse me, Hollywood was burgeoning on the West Coast, that there was a lot of mystery. And the newspapers of the day, if you look at the Ithaca Journal of the day, they were chock full of articles about the comings and goings of the actors and their entourages, not only what was playing in what theater. And there were 7 incredibly beautiful movie palaces in downtown Ithaca in this period, which is very, it's amazing to kind of think of that. Only the State Theater remains and sort of a piece of the Crescent Theater on Aurora. But people were very, very excited by this new art form. And in fact, the Wharton's put a little ad in the newspaper at one point inviting people to come down to the park. It was called Renwick Park, not Stewart Park as it is now, to watch movies being made. And apparently so many people, I mean, hundreds of people showed up that it completely got in the way of the work that they were doing. They're filming that they retracted in another newspaper ad. They actually retracted the invitation and said, no, 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 don't come. And, you know, please stay home. Do not come. We need to get our work done. So, you know, in the same way today, people are still fascinated by film. That was, you know, of course, the case back then. So anyway, I'm looking, not seeing any other questions. So it's a wrap, as they would say, in the world of film production. And I just really want to thank you, Professor Green, for the lecture about Irene Castle. I encourage everyone to go see Serial Style, The Business of Being. Irene Castle is part of as Professor Green mentioned, a broader exhibit, Breaking Barriers, Women's Lives and Livelihoods, and it's up through February, so there's a lot of time to see it. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.